watching The Paul Stefan Show on TV Free Baltimore.
Hello, this is Paul Stefan with another edition of our show, and we are very privileged today to have as our guest Mr. Mark Redfield. You may know him here in Baltimore for his portrayal of Edgar Allan Poe, but he is so much more. He is an actor, a director, a writer, a producer, and an artist. And we're going to touch on all those areas today. And welcome, Mark.
Oh, it's nice to be here. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Now, tell me, are you a Baltimore native?
I sort of am.
Sort of?
Yeah. I'm a military brat. I was born in Fort Meade, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
My dad had done a tour and was in Korea for a while and decided he wanted to teach art. Mm-hmm. So he went to school in Baltimore to get his sheepskin to be able to teach. Mm-hmm. And as he was finishing up his storied military career, mm-hmm. We were living in Baltimore.
Oh, okay.
But because he was in the service that 7 a.m. morning many years ago that we won't pinpoint exactly, we made the long trek, and I guess it was we, because I...
Okay. And then, because he was in the service, you traveled around.
We did a little bit. His family is out west. Arizona, New Mexico, California, now Washington State and Texas. Mm-hmm. But we did settle here for a while. When I was a kid, we were in Wisconsin, but we did settle here, and he taught high school and then moved on to teach at Towson University.
Oh, he did?
Yeah.
Okay, is that how you got to Towson University?
Yeah, it was cheaper, except for books.
Of course.
I had to pay full price for books, but basically, I did get a little bit of a break because Dad was faculty in the art department there. So
there you go. So we'll start with the acting part. The best I could do as far as trying to hit all your many areas of expertise, I'll call them. I'm going to do them within each one of your realms.
Sure, we could do them alphabetically, we could do them in order of appearance, we could do whatever you want.
I want to start then with the most obvious one, which is the acting.
Okay.
Where did you first get the acting bug, I might as well say, or where did first...
Well, I've lived long enough now and thought about that, or been asked that question enough now.
I'm sure.
I think I was born with it. I mean, I'm not kidding. I just there isn't, every time I push back a little bit further, mm-hmm. To find out where did the bug bite. It seems to have, the compulsion mm-hmm. to act, to tell a story, to play characters was always there. Of course, it's influenced by television you see and movies you see as a kid and that mm-hmm. kind of thing. And I was exposed to theater at a fairly young age and, mm-hmm. and art and creative people. So I think it was sort of always there. It just seemed to be something that captured me. I can pinpoint maybe several moments as a child, and then mm-hmm. my first drama class was when I was in the third grade and was attending school while we lived in Menominee, Wisconsin. That was the first actual structured acting class I had, and we ended up making a film at the end of it.
Oh,
and I played the villain, so
Ooh.
a pattern was started from that early age. So.
And then there were a couple of other moments you said, a couple key moments.
Well, there are. I mean, there. Growing up in Baltimore, there were things that I distinctly remember that I talk about with my mother and sometimes my dad about things that influenced me. There was a fellow many, many years ago in the late 50s and early 60s who was a local star, a fellow named Stu Kerr.
Of course. I know him quite well. I mean, from watching him, not knowing him.
Right. Kerr did the weather on WMAR-TV 2 in Baltimore. And he, like a number of employees at stations around the country, did children's shows.
Right.
Every station wanted to do some sort of... they were franchising Sally, the Romper Room.
Oh, yes.
There was Bozo the Clown, and Stu Kerr's character was Professor Cool.
Professor Cool, yeah.
And so I would watch him... a fellow who is now a friend of mine, Dick Dizell, mm-hmm. who was down in Channel 20.
Okay.
he was their Bozo the Clown for a while, and he eventually became Captain 20, and he became Count Gordeval, which he still plays Count Gordeval on the internet.
I know who he is very well, yeah.
So Dick is now a friend, but he was doing Bozo, and when I was a kid, I would see these characters on television, and they would, and then other great classic comedians that were still alive and still working. And in the 60s, it was a nice time because we were exposed to Laurel and Hardy and the Three Stooges. And these are all things that sort of got in, and I would imitate them.
Okay.
And one of the distinct memories I have even before I started school was having watched Bozo on television, Bozo the Clown, and which, along with Ronald McDonald, is partly responsible for destroying what clowns really are, and probably why we have Stephen King's It and Pennywise and A Fear of Clowns today.
Yes.
But anyway, I distinctly remember that when early, I would watch this show. And like a lot of kids of my era, I had cowboy outfits, and I had a red cowboy hat, and I remember turning it sideways and upside down so that I could have Bozo hair, and I could reenact what he did that day.
Oh, okay.
So, again, I think it was kind of stamped on me all along. And the only credence I'll give to it being in the DNA is that my mother and father met doing theater.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a story.
He was, as I mentioned earlier, he was finishing up his stint in the military, and he was doing a number of things. And he was nearby in Baltimore. Okay. My mother was here. She had come to this country from Germany in the late 50s.
Okay.
And one of the jobs she had was working at Nyborg's. There was a fabulous art store downtown on Charles Street. It ended up on Charles Street before they closed in the early 80s. They were Nyborg's art supply store. Okay. I shopped there when I was a young man. But my mother worked there, and they were involved with a woman named Audrey Herman, who ran an outfit with a group of people called the Spotlighters Theater.
Oh, of course.
And before they had their home on where they currently are, and the outfit is run by Fuzz Rourke right now.
Now, weren't the ones is that the one that actually were on St. Paul?
This is on St. Paul.
Yes.
It's run by Fuzz Rourke right now, but at the time they didn't have a permanent home. They were jobbing out and running around doing all kinds of great theater in high schools, auditoriums, whatever they could find. And so the story goes, they decided to do a production of Anti-Mame. The director, who I have no idea what that director's name was, put a call out for men. A bunch of soldiers from Fort Meade came up, and my dad was one of the people who auditioned, got the role of Patrick. My mother was stage managing and working on the thing because she had been involved with Audrey and the Nyborgs, who were friends. And so they met doing theater, and no, I can't claim I was born in a trunk, but again, it's sort of in the DNA.
Exactly.
So.
That's what it sounds like. So, I mean, you get hinted a little bit there, because I was going to go into saying, well, who were your influences? Who were like the Hollywood or the theater people that you admired or the most, or you may have patterned yourself after? Or
when you're young and you start to think about this professionally, you start to think about, well, maybe I could really do this. And this was maybe even for me before I got into college. I mean, my heroes are sort of the typical ones that a white male actor has. Laurence Olivier was one, but I went further back too. As a kid, I caught on to people like Lon Chaney very early, John Barrymore very early. I mean, so it's a range of, and today they're not really role models, but of course they're just actors that I just have enormous respect for. They run the gamut of ability and temperament and size of performance. So in that pot now, along with actors like Olivier and people who transform themselves, like Alec Guinness or Peter Sellers, there are people like Jack Lemmon, Jack Nicholson, and James Cagney is high on the list of actors, and Zero Mostel is a favorite actor. Jackie Gleason, comedians like Red Skelton are very important to me. That had things that just continued to inspire me or excite me, and so it's a broad range of actors. I don't think they have any one thing in common. But they all went into the pot, and they all had something to do, and I am fans to this day of everybody I've just mentioned. But the interesting thing is, I started catching wind of them when I was a teenager.
Right.
That's when they started getting in, somehow.
I see. Now, interesting thing to me, I would say if you agree with this or not, is I think you look at performers like you've mentioned, and a lot of them were people I consider entertainers.
Oh.
They were multifaceted. It wasn't just an actor or a comedian. They could sing, they could dance, they could do drama, they could do comedy, they could do pantomime like Red Skelton. They could do all kinds of things, and you don't see so much of that kind of complete package anymore.
No, you really don't. And the thing is, and I guess you're thinking of people like Cagney who could sing and dance, and
right,
within
sure.
his very narrow way, his limited ability was enormous.
Yeah.
Which didn't seem limited at all. Jackie Gleason is somebody that I think have mentioned, and if I haven't, I'm remiss because, he's someone, and by the same token, some of these same comedians, could play drama, which is interesting because often very serious actors have difficulty going in that direction. And then as far as giants in the field, I'm a massive fan of Chaplin and Keaton.
Okay.
The silent film comedians, the very physical comedians, that's certainly something that we really don't have anymore. And even though generationally we leap from a Jerry Lewis to a Jim Carrey, we really don't have the kind of physical comedians, I think, that are universal and don't really need language to tell the story. I mean, Dick Van Dyke, who is still alive, and I hope when this is broadcast is still with us,
yes, I do too.
is one of those few actors in the 20th century, latter half of the 20th century, that could be as funny physically without saying a word as he could verbally. So Chaplin and Keaton are also people that got in very, very early. And some of my early theater work was sort of inspired by their work in film.
I was going to say that I think what was lost today, you see a lot of the slapsticky type stuff in Saturday Night Live and other places, but as a matter of Chaplin and Keaton, there was something more to it. There was depth in it. There was heart. With Chaplin, there was also the pathos.
There is, and to hark back on something I made a joke about in watching Bozo the Clown on television. Chaplin and Keaton are true clowns.
Yes.
The clown is a grotesque character. It's a very human character, and there should be a range of emotion, and that comes through even in Keaton. The famous stone face. When you mention things like Saturday Night Live, I mean, there's some brilliant actors on Saturday Night Live, but it's still verbal. It's still verbally driven. Right. Satire and television. Right. It's an old phrase that I think. This is attributed to Ed Wynn. I mean, it's basically radio with pictures. It really isn't a visual medium. And so even SNL is still very verbally driven with its scripts and things.
Right. Now, let me see if I can get into a little bit more about the acting. What was really your first professional role in acting?
First professional role, I would think, I was in college. I was at Towson University, and I was doing an enormous amount of theater. It was sort of nonstop. So burning the candle at both ends and being wild man about town too as a kid. And I think my first stuff, I actually began to do commercial work. I began to work at Maryland Public Television, PBS, our Maryland PBS station. At the time, there was an enormous amount of stuff that PBS was doing where they needed actors. They were doing a weekly, speaking of Saturday Night Live, they were doing a weekly series called Crabs. At the time, I did stuff on that. They were doing an enormous amount of educational work where they needed actors, and they needed sometimes comedic actors, or they needed character actors. So I was working there all the time. I did pilots for children's shows there. I began my first commercial work. This town meaning Baltimore, was relatively vibrant with some studios that no longer exist. Flight 3 was here, so I was doing I was doing voice work. I was doing commercials. Advertisers were very vibrant. This was a big advertiser town, and so they could employ voice actors and actors and that kind of thing. So these first jobs, and then my only stint in dinner theater, which I got fired from. So all of this was about the age of 18, 19, where I started working professionally, essentially.
Is that when you said, hey, I think I want to make this my life's work, or I can make money at this?
No, I decided to do that, I think, even earlier. There was a period as a teenager where, and I find this fascinating to this day, something that my dad said that kind of thunderstruck me as a young teenager. He said to me after seeing me in a play, "I'm glad you finally found something you can do." Even then, I was precocious enough to realize, what did you expect at this age? And the interesting thing is that I kind of knew it, and I wanted to make films. I was making films. I'm of a generation that didn't have video. We had Super 8 films. And so I was already making 8mm silent, and by the time I was 14, I was working on sound Super 8 films. Okay. And so when there's a place to go and you can act and feed this compulsion, and it's a word that I keep coming back to, even in my work that I'm doing now about artists that are just simply compelled to create or tell stories. Towson was the place to go. I could do it. I could act, and then by gosh, they let me. So I stayed there for a while, and I soaked up everything I could and learned everything I could. So it was early. I knew what I wanted to do, that I wanted to act and particularly make films.
Okay.
When I was a teenager. The one thing that my dad said to me also that I find fascinating, and he being an artist, you see, who is wonderfully bifurcated. On the one hand, his work and some of his thinking is incredibly liberal and progressive. And then in his life, financially and otherwise, he's somewhat conservative. Okay. And when I said to him when I was 13 years old that I wanted to be a magician, and what is a magician but an actor who acts the role of a magician?
So he said Roberta Houdin.
He said, my dad said to me, "You don't want to be a magician. Magicians get no respect and they make no money." And he was right. And we went out of a period where magic was incredibly popular in the late 70s. You had people like, Doug Henning and that kind of thing. And there were people actually still working in nightclubs doing magic. And of course, the magic that I wanted to do was very romantic and very retro. The tailcoat magician, the full stage show, which the last person to do that in Baltimore was George Goebbels, who
very famous.
Until he died, ran A.T. Jones Costumer. So basically, and then after wanting to be a magician, it was to be a cartoon animator. And again, what is an animator but an actor with a pencil? So I kind of knew that I was going in that direction, and it was just climbing the rope to get there.
As you bring that up, I was going to get into the time to bring this question up. What is your preference? Is it theater or film?
I don't really have one. Film is easier. Both are bloody hard. I don't mean to be flippant about that. They're both very, very difficult. The audience can only see and hear you. The audience doesn't care what you had for dinner. They don't care what personal problems you have. They really don't. If they're going to watch play, if they're going to see a film, on a film they can only see what's in the rectangle in the screen. If they're watching a play, depending on how good their ears and eyesight are, they can only see. Right. And the director can, in some ways, guide the eye a little bit. The director in film can do the same thing. You have less control over film in what your performance is. So they each require different tools.
Right.
I find, though, at this stage of my career, that I enjoy film much, much more because you don't have to carry the performance for as long as you do in a play. Right. If you have any sizable role in a play, it is quite a physical, athletic endeavor.
Yes.
If you are the lead, let's just take an obvious example. If you're playing Macbeth in Macbeth, you've got a lot of work to do, and it's physical work, and it's vocal work, and you're exhausted by the end of it, and you've got to remember all of those lines.
Right, exactly.
If you're doing a film, you get to do it in bits and pieces. Now, where the energy is spent, and this is something people don't understand really, is that a lot of film, there's a lot of downtime. We're going to do a 2-shot of us talking, and then we're going to cut to a close-up of me. I have to have a certain kind of energy in my close-up to make it match, make sure that I'm remembering for continuity, emotionally and physically what I was doing. And then if we don't pick this scene up until next week, I've got a lot of homework to do. So the tiring thing is all of this waiting. Waiting can be, and doing nothing can be just so draining. And then you've got a powerful moment that you've got to perform on camera at the end of the day.
Right.
And you've said, so you're using your energy differently, but you've only got to work in those bits and pieces.
Right, exactly.
And I think that that, and the other thing that I have fallen in love with is basically radio plays or audio plays.
Ah, yes. We'll get into your radio career, but go ahead.
And I just want to touch on that right now because there are worlds of storytelling possibilities in audio drama. And, it does take, again, a certain amount of energy, but you can show up in your pajamas, unshaven. You can be reading the script after you've become familiar and rehearsed it and not sound like you're reading it.
Right.
So, again, the work is placed in a different place, but there are things about it that are easier than working live on stage. Okay. And I miss working live. I am writing a play now, and I think about it occasionally. I think occasionally that, boy, it would be nice to do a play, and then I, wake up and have my first cup of coffee and I get over it, or I have somebody talk me out of it.
Well, the way to get around that is write a one-act play.
It's not even. None of that is any easy.
None of that's any easy.
Not really. The pressure is then to do something really wonderful in a shorter amount of time.
All right.
If you do a longer play with a lot of characters, then you can spread the blame around a little bit.
Okay. Now, I know you got your training at Towson, but I also saw that you got training through UNESCO?
Yeah, the UNESCO Theatre of Nations University. It's been an ongoing concern that is part of UNESCO's outreach, for all of the things that UNESCO does so wonderfully. And in the early 80s, when I had finished with Towson, and my graduate school, in some ways, there's nothing legitimate about it, it's a metaphor, was the Baltimore Theatre Project.
Yes.
And Philip Arnaud. He had started the theater project in 1971, and I had seen things as a teenager, as a kid there, when it was a big open space on Preston Street, Hepzibah Hall.
I remember.
And I had a friend who was a set designer, a lighting designer, named David Stubenrausch, the late David Stubenrausch. And we had done some things together. I had directed a production of Mice and Men, and he designed the lights for that. And he had mentioned to Philip they were raising money to create fixed seating and dressing rooms and storage and do all of these renovations to the Baltimore Theatre Project. And Ethel Ennis and her husband Earl Arnett were going to open Ethel's Place, a jazz club.
I was there
below.
at Ethel's Place, yes.
And so because I've done many things, and I do many things in my career, and because I had designed some sets and done some of that kind of thing, David tipped off to Philip that I would be a good person to build a model of the finished theater project that you could take apart and show prospective donors and underwriters lift out the seating, and here's the gallery which is now called the John Fonda Gallery, and lift the entire theater out, and here would be Ethel's Place, and I based these, of course, on the blueprints that the architects had done. And Carol Bache, his wife, and Philip Arnaud came to the house, and we talked about it. And that was the first time Philip had called me. Now, the funny thing about the relationship is that while I was still at Towson, while I was still at school, I called Carol. And I said, I've got a great idea. Why not why not have a repertory company at the Theatre Project? And she very politely, not knowing who I was, took my call and said, well, that's not really what we do at the Theatre Project. Right. Well, from that point on of building the model with Philip, and he got to know my work, I was acting at Center Stage and doing other things. I then started, over the years, I've done many plays at the Theatre Project, and Philip became a very good friend. And I did other things there, too, to make ends meet. I was their house manager. I was a graphic artist for them. Wow. I cleaned the toilets and swept the floors. I basically learned how to run a theater, and I met companies from all over the world of all kinds of disciplines. Movement theater companies, dance companies, vocal actors, one-man performers. Fred Kerchak comes to mind with his one-man Tempest. A Communicado, a Scottish company that did an incredible production, 5 actors, an incredible muscular production of The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Wow.
Israeli companies from all over the world.
Terrific training.
This is why, just watching them, talking to these artists, these actors, these directors, that's why I say it became coming right out of a wonderful few years at Towson University,
right,
where at Towson alone, I think I did 30 to 70 plays, and that includes summer stock and community theater at that time, and the dinner theater play that I got fired from,
which shall remain nameless.
Well, I'd be happy to talk about it. It's actually a very funny story, and it's about this. It's about burning out. It's about doing too much, which is a lesson I keep relearning.
Okay.
But Theater Project, bless Philip and the experience that I had there, really truly became my graduate school, and that provoked me to do my first theater company, which was called Industrial Strength Theater.
Yes, I was going to get into that. You have founded 2 theater companies.
2 theater companies that were both very successful creatively.
And the New Century Theater.
And New Century Theater, 5 years later, after trying to raise money for a movie that I didn't make, and then went back head first into a creative frenzy for 2 solid years and produced 10 plays, actually. But anyway, the Theater Project was an incredible time. That then circles back to how I got connected with a play and UNESCO, but a play that was being performed by an international cast in France.
Oh, okay.
And it was sponsored by and large by the Theater of Nations University, which was a branch of what UNESCO was doing with theater artists at the time. Right. And we workshopped Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, a Molière play, The Would-Be Gentleman. And so that was a period. And then I spent another month and a half in Paris soaking up the sights and came back to wanting to make films, oddly enough.
Interesting.
But,
Now, with the theater, your 2 theater companies, you said they were successful. Were they local?
They were both Baltimore companies. The first one, though, toured.
It did.
Industrial Strength Theater was, my idea at the time was there was a renaissance, in a way, of small independent theater companies that had no home and were sort of rootless and moved around. Some of this was influenced by the companies that were coming into the Theater Project, but there was just something in the air, something in the water at that time, in the early to mid-'80s, where people said, I'm planting a flag, I'm making theater in Baltimore. Growing out of that period came one of the few companies that actually rooted in physical space, in real estate, and grew, and that was Everyman Theater.
Everyman Theater, I was going to bring that up, yeah.
He started doing, again, the early productions became itinerant, at theaters. And,
right.
and if I'm not mistaken, Vince did an early production at the Spotlighters, rented that, like New Century did, my second company. But Industrial Strength Theater, I wanted to do something very, very different. And nobody was really doing movement theater, let alone comedy. And if they were doing movement theater and they were influenced by companies that were out of New York, like Audubon or Mummenschanz in San Francisco, and other pantomime or movement theater, things that were coming out of Europe at the time, clowns, that Avner the Eccentric, kind of thing. I mean, true clown work and true movement work. I found a 5-page short story written by Heinrich Boll that actually is as appropriate to adapt today and do as it was back then. It was called My Sad Face.
Oh, okay.
And I saw immediately the opportunity to do sort of a live Chaplin, Buster Keaton sort of pantomime comedy based on that. And so I adapted that with Tommy Casiro, who still teaches mime at Towson University. It was one of the first things that Tommy did. He, oddly enough, came out of he was studying psychology and psychiatry at Towson University and moved over to theater. And moved into mime, and now he's teaching there. So it's one of the first things that I asked him to collaborate so that we could train a group of 5 actors, because I knew and was fairly proficient at pantomime and mime techniques, and I was going to play a very Chaplin-esque hero in this thing. And the story of My Sad Face that Bowl wrote is basically a great metaphor, a great Kafkaesque kind of horror story about a man who has the right emotions at the wrong time in a fascist, in a totalitarian state. And so a very simplistic thing that I thought could be told with a lot of humor and a lot of sort of black humor mixed in, sort of a nice. So we found 5 wonderful actors, and I ended up being so incredibly lucky having a composer, Ann Watts, come in with 5 musicians. So we were a company technically of 11 people live on stage. You could see the band at the same time that you could see the actors perform what we turned into a 75-minute piece without intermission. And we opened at a space that I don't know is still viable as a performance space in Baltimore, but in the mid-'80s, it was St. John's Church, just in Charles Village there.
Okay.
And people were renting that. They had a horrible fire that had gutted the place out. And one of the things that they were doing is community outreach. We're renting it to people. And so you had this huge, beautiful room to do theater in. And so we did that there. And I didn't know what to expect in 1985 when we premiered this. And it was December of 1985. And opening night, we had oversold the house. Now, I don't know, the fire marshal was nowhere near us. The balcony was still in existence, and it was full of people from side to side, front to back. And this is before the internet. This is before social media, Twitter, and the internet.
Of course.
You're simply, literally taping and stapling posters that you got at the copy place, and you're charging $5 a ticket. And it was so wonderfully successful. And we did it at the Theater Project, and we toured it then up and down the East Coast. We wanted to take it to Edinburgh. It didn't happen. The second year of the company, we were trying to negotiate to have a home, and we were talking at that time to Loyola. Okay. Jim Dockery was there at the time, and some other people, and unfortunately, it didn't work out. And it was an ambitious. I was working on a new adaptation of the text of Brecht's Threepenny Opera to do for our second season, and to do another full movement theater piece. So that's the story behind that. And again, it plugs back to just the influence of Chaplin and Keaton.
Exactly.
My love for their
Again,
work.
With all of that, it keeps coming back. Now, in film, was The Screaming Dead your first film?
Technically, it wasn't my first film. I was making Super 8 films. I was doing animation. I was doing actually cartoon animation and model clay animation. And there was the film that I suggested in my 3rd grade acting class.
Was The Screaming Dead a 35 millimeter, a bigger?
Well, it was the first feature film. It is also the worst film ever made.
Really?
It is. I'll fight any man in the place to tell me that there's a more horrible film. It was made for $12,000. Part of it was actually shot in my mother's backyard.
Wow. Okay.
We dug some holes and put some zombies in there. Zombies have always been part of the popular culture, and they're cheap to do, and they were very cheap to do. I guess this would be 1982. The funny story about that was I was doing a musical, which I do rarely, but we were doing Dear World, and the lead was played by the late Vivian Shaw, Baltimore actor.
A legend, yes.
I loved Vivian very, very much. And I was the rag picker, and had grown a beard, grown this big thing. And the director of the the musical, had taken the score and the music and put the play back into it and kind of mushed it up, and kind of breaking all the rules when you license a musical. And so my role was richer for that. And one day I get a call from a fellow named Tony Malinowski, who I had met earlier in my teenage movie career, and because he had found out that I had some talent for doing makeup.
Oh, okay.
playing with, crepe hair and putty and noses and things. And he said, could you come and help us make up some zombies? And they were shooting at a friend's house up the street that I had made a Super 8 film with a couple of years before. Okay. I walked onto the set with my makeup kit to make up a couple of zombies, just have some fun. He looked at me and my beard and he said, do you want to be the lead zombie in this? Do you want to be the main zombie character who's leading this Confederate army of the undead to recover this precious diary or something? Okay. And I said, sure, why not? And so I did that. And then we dug a hole and I came out of it in somebody's farm on some other scenes. And then I shaved mine. This is typical of independent filmmaking. And then I'd shaved my beard, obviously, to do other roles and other things. And they had more to shoot. So I had to glue a fake one on 6 months later and shoot some other stuff. So technically, Curse of the Screaming Dead, which I think that's its original title. Troma Films, Lloyd Kaufman picked it up years ago and changed the title to something else that I'm blanking on right now. So it, like a lot of things, has had a number of titles. And here's the last thing I want to say about that Curse of the Screaming of Dead, because it really is one of the worst films ever made, and I love it. I'm in London. I'm in Manchester. I'm somewhere in England, and this fellow has this enormous coffee table book about exploitation films of the 80s. Okay. And I love exploitation films. The more Grindhouse, the more 42nd Street back in the day, the more. And I'm flipping through this thing, and suddenly I start recognizing pictures. I'm recognizing people from Curse of the Screaming Dead in photos that I had never seen before. Wow. Ever. And he's got 20 pages. He does an entire chapter on this film. Wow. And because of that book, and there was this weird period in the early part of the 20th century, 2000, 2001, where people were going out of their way, paying big money to collect VHS clamshell boxes of bad horror movies. I mean, they were paying through the nose. Wow. People found me on the internet because I played Captain whoever this was. Yes, okay. And I mean, my God, the effects. They blow up and burn a police car, and it's not, I'm not kidding, it's a little plastic model kit where the flames are so out of proportion, and it's really bad, it's so funny. But that was the shocker that told me that there was a fan base for this film that I just really didn't know existed. And Tony's gone on to other great things. He's been editing, Tony Malinowski, he's been editing things for Disney for years. He's been making, I ended up just several years ago doing a history piece called The Battle of Bunker Hill. Oh, okay. Which has dramatic things intercut with talking heads, talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill. Of course. So we've all graduated on to other things, but who knew that there was such a ravenous fan base for this film?
Well, speaking of that, it seems like the majority of your films, looking at your filmography, are what I would call in the Gothic genre or Gothic/adventure genre. Was this just by circumstance or by choice?
Well, they are. I mean, both. Maybe they're. I've tried to define when I've had little flashes of popularity in the genre among fans and that kind of thing. I'm not really a horror guy. I'm not really a horror filmmaker. I tend to be, fantasy films, and the things that I like are the fantasy. I mean, I think the films I liked the best were the Ray Harryhausen films, the Sinbad films. Right. Fantasy films, comedies like The Great Race, and things like that had a flirtation with steampunk and fantasy, but weren't. Right. But they had to do with adventure, and then I loved adventure films. I loved Tarzan films. I loved, and growing up and coming into the 70s, you had a great era to see things on the big screen for the first time, like Star Wars and like the Christopher Reeve 1978 Superman and things like that. So I think it's fantasy that I like. Okay. Even though I've done a couple of out-and-out horror films. Right. That's kind of where my head is to this day. Yeah.
The one outlier, I think, is Cold Harbor.
It is. I was, interestingly enough, at that time, which I guess technically is the first feature film that I am a producer of. And I was trying to get a film off the ground based on Poe's The Telltale Heart. And my concept for The Telltale Heart as a feature-length film, a 90-minute film, was that, obviously Poe's story is dramatized in our climax, but what I did was I invented a situation where it was immediate days after Lincoln is assassinated during the Civil War. And we are under martial law, and we are in the Maryland, Northern Virginia area, and so all of my action took place around a boarding house where some people, a couple are fleeing from Richmond after it burned, and our serial killer ends up being one of the people taking refuge in this house. The house is run by an old German woman, and her invalid husband is the man with one eye, the bad eye, the vulture eye.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of great things that I could mix into that, and I was very close to raising money for it, and worked very hard on it. And I went to an audition as an actor at Fox 45, our local Fox affiliate at the time. And the fellow that was running the audition, he was in their television department and handling commercials and that kind of thing, was a fellow named Tom Brando.
Okay.
Tom and I hadn't seen each other in a few years. Tom and I both went to Towson together. There's an old thing that a very, very, very dear friend of mine, the late Marvin Lusky, once said to me. He said to me in a group of young beginning actors, saying, look around at the people right and left of you in this room today, because somebody in the future is going to hire somebody else here. And that's almost always the case in these things. And so I hadn't seen Tom in a number of years. He was more heavily in the film department, where I minored, and I was 100% very heavy in the theater department, where he dabbled a little bit. And at one point we worked on a play that he shot some 16 millimeter footage with, so we knew each other in college. And so we auditioned, and it's like, well, we should catch up. What are you doing? I'm trying to make a feature film based on The Telltale Heart. He says, I'm trying to make a feature film based on my true life story of my dad's suicide, called Brother's Keeper at the time, it was called. And I said, well, we should talk. And I couldn't get my film off, which was, of course, a period film and things. I couldn't get it off the ground. And Tom and I met, and I just saw all kinds of potential in this wonderful story. And he had been trying for 2 or 3 years, and different configurations of things and different budgets. And one day, Tom was thinking about his future, was thinking that a career in affiliate television was sort of limited for the creative things he wanted to do. He had won an award for a marvelous whaling documentary he had done. He had various interests in film that he wanted to pursue. He wanted to make this film about his dad and his brothers.
Right.
And so he quit Fox 45. He got into his truck and he drove out to see some friends in New Mexico and decided he wanted to drive up to Alaska and just think. Okay. So he called me from about 5 miles inside the Arctic Circle from a phone booth, and he said to me, I've decided I'm going to make Cold Harbor. I have a little bit of money from my inheritance, and I've been thinking about this for so many years now, and I said to him, Tom, I want you to think about this on your drive back to Baltimore from the Arctic Circle.
Right. Yeah.
When you get here and you get out of your truck and you say to me, we're making Cold Harbor, I will back you 100% and we will make this film. If you have had second thoughts, we'll do whatever you want. Well, He pulled up, beard.
Okay.
He had been to the wilderness and had his visions, and so I said, okay, we've got X amount of money between the two of us. We can get this film shot on film in the can, but we're going to struggle and pay in time because we're not going to have the money for post-production. If you are prepared to do that, we're in. We started immediately to look at locations. We worked on the script. We changed the title to Cold Harbor. There was a fabulous documentary that was called Brother's Keeper at the time, and we thought we would have the kind of luck that people were having at that time in film festivals that has changed a little bit. But anyway, the long and short of it is we jumped into it because we were spending our own money and our own credit cards to make up for what we didn't have. And we put a fabulous crew together. As a matter of fact, I just ran into David O'Farrell the other day. He was, even in those early days, was working with IATSE so that we could get a professional crew. David Mullett, Peter Mullett, forgive me, okay. Peter. Okay. Peter Mullett was our DP. Beautiful. Dwayne Dell was our sound on location. All of the actors came from the Mid-Atlantic area.
Okay.
We had 2 different casting directors, and we were looking at actors from Virginia up to Philadelphia.
It was shot here?
And it was shot in Rehoboth.
Oh, Rehoboth.
We did everything wrong. In other words, when the best advice you can get in making an independent film is make a list of everything you have that's free to you.
Okay.
If your uncle owns a great store, if your aunt owns this fantastic car, make a list of things that you have free access to that gives you production value, that you don't have to pay for, that you don't have to pay insurance for. We did everything wrong in that we went to another state,
right,
to another town, trying to negotiate everything, including in our climax, the brothers in beginning to put to rest their father and everything they went through. We burn a boat in the climax of the thing, which is on the cover of our DVD and the poster art. And so it was an enormous amount. It was about 5 months of solid production. It was, immediately producing a film is a full-time job. It's like going to war. You don't take it lightly. If you make a decision, you commit, and then you're in it. And not only are you in it, but the catchphrase that I shared with Tom and became the running joke among everybody was from the wonderful film with Gregory Peck. And there's a scene with Gregory Peck and David Niven in The Guns of Navarone. Niven is upset because the explosive had been ruined. Mm-hmm. And he's throwing a bitch fit to Gregory Peck.
Okay.
And Peck basically shuts him up. He says, "You're in it now. Up to your neck." Mm-hmm. And that was our war cry.
Okay.
And we shot it in 18 days in Rehoboth. You'll notice that some things are still standing in our pre-title sequence and things that are actually Ocean City, Maryland. But between that, Fenwick Island and Rehoboth were our fictional town of Cold Harbor. And it's a very simple story that I think is very well told. I think Tom did a wonderful job with it, about these 4 brothers that deal with the beginning stages of closure of loss, particularly when something is so shocking as suicide. So it's timeless themes that humans and families go through, particularly difficult with men who even today, this late in the 21st century, is that where we are now, the 21st century?
Check your watch.
Don't really communicate emotions and their feelings very well. And so it doesn't prescribe a pill to take to deal with these kind of things, but it shows in a very sometimes very humorous way, and very very truly felt way. And at the same time saying that, it's interesting because I get this question a lot: that how difficult it must have been for Tom Brandow to make this film, to write and direct this film. And it really wasn't, for one reason, to put the emotion out. When you're making a piece of art, when you're making a play, when you're making a thing, it is at arm's length in some ways. The events that happened to Tom were long ago. That's in the past. He's had time to reflect that. He's had time to reflect that in writing the script. Once you start making the practical realities happen of a film, it is so removed from the kind of realities that would really provoke a thing. Your job is to create emotion in the audience at that point. I think that the only real gut-wrenching stuff that Tom and I went through was the fact that we were spending our own money on a film that we knew we're going to do this because we want to do it and we're never going to make our money back.
Now, would you say, though, what you just said about people, so was it difficult for him? Do you feel that doing the process of making this film was cathartic for him?
Oh, it was. And the key moment, I think, in a project like this, because, my goal as a producer and Tom's friend was to make a film that anybody could watch. It didn't matter what you knew. You didn't have to know that remotely it's based on anything that happened. We've fictionalized a lot. When he was working on the script that became Cold Harbor, I threw things in that happened to me because I come from a family of all brothers. So It was easy for me to include some things, and so it becomes very fictional in a way. So when we had the premiere at the Senator Theater, and members of his family saw it. His father, of course,
was gone.
And is a memory to the people who then come, including his mother. and his living brothers. It was incredibly cathartic. It was wonderful. It brought closure. It brought dialogue. It was a wonderful thing on a personal level. And then I was overjoyed that the reaction to it as a piece of drama, as a film, that people like it. It is not great melodrama. You know, we don't find out dark secrets. It's not the Hallmark movie of the week where, you know, it's just this constant pounding of melodrama. It's just this nice little turn. And I have hair.
The theme is universal.
I actually have real hair in that film.
You were the eldest brother.
And it's one of the reasons I like the film so much.
But I'm thinking, I tell you, I mean, I don't know if I can get the film to look at it, but I saw the 2.5-minute trailer, which is on your IMDb page, and it was impressive, I thought.
Thank you. Yeah.
And of you and the other gentlemen, the other brothers, the acting that was done. And I said, this is something that should have been seen or should be seen, because I think is what you're addressing to me. It has a universal theme.
Oh, I think
and
it does.
a timeless theme.
Yeah, it does. And, you know, they're apples and oranges. They're miles apart. But I think one of the reasons I am attracted to fantasy storytelling in films is because they often have universal themes as well. You know, this was never about when Tom approached me and we were working on it as an exercise for him. That was almost never a consideration. It was sort of after the fact, as you mentioned, was it cathartic? It was after the fact of certain milestones, like the premiere at the Senator Theater. Then there's a realization that he had, and we had discussions after that. And we're just happy that people keep, you know, it's available on DVD, and we're just happy that people keep discovering it.
Good.
And yeah, cell phones are bigger in this film than they are today, and and things like that. But by and large, it still works. It works very much as a contemporary story.
Now, you've done a lot of other films, so I really am only touching on a few. The other one I want to bring up is your portrayal and your production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Oh,
I'm glad
you brought that
one
up.
You have mentioned in some video interviews I saw on YouTube that there have been many, and I know there have been many productions of this story.
Yeah.
You know, you've got Frederick March, Spencer Tracy,
John
all
Barrymore.
these people. John Barrymore,
Michael
I've seen
Caine.
that one too. All these great actors have taken on this role.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to, I know this, Richard Mansfield.
Yeah.
Who was the first portrayer in the 1880s on stage. And he did the transformation without makeup, it was told.
Right.
And
Which is myth making. The same thing about Barrymore in his film. You know, that's amazing what he could do without.
Yeah.
No,
but you don't think Mansfield did use makeup? Or he didn't?
Oh, he did. He did certain things. And
he did do certain things.
Yeah.
Okay, because they always said it. They used to say that not so much about Barrymore, but it was one of the versions. Whether it was Tracy or Frederick March. They said, well, they didn't use any makeup.
The both of those. But the myth making is always, you got to remember that a lot of these get started before we could see the film so easily.
Yeah.
Which is a strange irony that people complain that we are in an age with Netflix. I don't want to go off on too drastic a tangent, and that the classics are not respected, and we don't see them as much and that kind of thing. So in a way, yes, we do have so many avenues and ways of seeing films that they're not right front and center of us. Like growing up, I mentioned, it was easy to see the Three Stooges or Laurel and Hardy on television because there were only 3 stations. Yeah. Now there are so many choices, you have to find something that is spurring the need to go to investigate that. So they're all out there, but these myths like Barrymore didn't need makeup in his transformation, and he's got a heavy makeup on. This starts in an age before you could check so easily. Right. And one author, without really checking his facts or even watching the film, can write about it in a film book, and then this becomes currency for 40, 50, 60 years. Yeah. But your question is...
Why did you take on such a time-worn project, and how is your version different from all the others?
I did it because nobody else was doing it on stage, and I started its genesis. It began as a stage production because I wanted a meaty role. 2, it is no different from anybody else's. I think that in some ways, it is the Jekyll and Hyde blender smoothie version of every version that has come before. And I tried to, and there's a distinction here which people have beat me up on. I think we followed the spirit of Stevenson's novella And certainly not the letter of the law of his in adapting his novella.
Okay.
Stuart Wojtyla, my off-time writing partner.
Right.
But to answer your question succinctly, and I'm glad because I am very proud of that film. It's something that I still like. I would do. I would make a very different film today. There's just no two ways about it.
You do that same project differently today.
If today I would do something massively different, it would probably be less talky.
Yeah.
It would probably be more visual. There would probably be fewer characters. But it started as a stage play and an exercise to have a challenging challenge. I was looking for something I could sink my teeth into as an actor. There were stage productions, where the actors, the Jekyll and Hyde are played by two different actors. The musical sometimes did that. There's several musicals in the last.
So many different versions. There's Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde with
my
Martine
friend
Bestwick, who you know.
Yeah, Martine Bestwick is a very good friend, and working with her now. And that's where it starts. We had a very successful production of it on stage. And then when I was looking for, and the reason I wanted to do it and sell certain things with the transformation and the character of Hyde is if you're going to announce to an audience you're going to do Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde on stage, it's the same thing as saying to an audience, we're going to do Ben-Hur on stage. The first thing they're going to think is, how are you going to do the chariot race? And with Jekyll and Hyde, how are you going to do the transformations?
Exactly.
Are you going to switch actors? That's kind of a cheat. So our violence in the stage play was incredibly naturalistic and realistic, as heightened as I designed the show physically. And Hyde, Jekyll was played in a very naturalistic style. Hyde was incredibly theatrical. And through all of that, I did some minimal things, but it was all physical acting and voice. And I tried some things in early performances with liquid latex to pull the eyes down for Hyde. They went away because it just became kind of cumbersome. I was doing enough with Hyde on stage, and I had teeth that a dentist made that were broken. So then it came time to do a film,
Right.
and I wanted to do something, and there really hadn't been a Jekyll and Hyde for a while. And you look at one's strengths, and I thought, let's take the risk of doing a Gothic horror piece, but if I say so myself, I'm not too bad as Jekyll and Hyde. So that's a strength I could bring to it, and that's why I chose to make a film. Having said that, there are people who have never seen the play that Stuart and I wrote or read it, and they say, well, we get it. We understand, and if they don't like the film, they say, we get it because it's based on their play. What they don't realize is how different it is. It is night and day. We threw the entire second act of our play away and did something completely different. So the characters, the thrust, the action, much of it is the same as the play, but the film gave us opportunities to do things that we couldn't possibly do. And I wanted something that was very dreamlike and very theatrical, very traditional in its storytelling. It should feel like a mid-century 40s, 50s, 60s movie. Very classic Hollywood filmmaking.
Or like a Hammer film?
Not so much as a Hammer film then,
Okay.
but in that it was a film that was very classically shot.
Okay.
Master shots,
Sure.
reverse, that kind of thing. Very much a Hollywood film.
Hollywood
feel.
film, right.
But at the same time, be toy-like. I wanted everything to be artificial. And that's why the decision was, instead of trying to find dark alley locations, which you can do, you can transform a city. It was actually shot in White Marsh, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
In my first studios. And you can find alleys and nooks and crannies in Ellicott City, in Baltimore, in Fells Point. You can make these places look like and we set ours in 1900 London.
Okay.
But I wanted everything to be very dreamlike and complete fantasy, and so all of the exteriors are miniatures.
Oh, interesting.
That are not quite realistic.
Were they miniatures that you had created?
Oh yeah, we had a team of people come in, and they were building miniatures for like 2.5 months.
Yeah. Oh, okay. What's next for Mark Redfield?
Well, the ongoing projects, I hope
that you've mentioned.
Yeah, I want to complete Alone, the life of Poe.
The Gorgons, House of the Gorgon.
House of the Gorgon should start doing festivals and convention screenings, and in October 2018,
Just missed the nostalgia convention. That would have been nice if we could play there in September.
Well, there's a possibility.
Yeah.
We have a very tight end of summer deadline.
Okay.
To have the film finished, so it's possible.
Okay.
We have some commitments, and we have others that we're making on that kind of thing. The Vampire Hunter series continues, so there'll be new novels.
Good.
There's no date. I'm shopping Houdini of the Secret Service, my
Interesting
big doorstopper novel, to publishers now, so there's no date for that. I've got a couple of films now that I'm back making films that I'd like to do, but I don't want to announce anything now.
Okay, sure, we understand.
You know, these things are they're so fickle. You never know what's going to happen. So if you follow on any of the websites, Redfield Arts Audio.
There we go. We want your contact information. Throw that in right now.
You know, you Google me.
Tell the folks.
I'm easy to find. You can the vampire stuff is all vampirehuntersinc.com.
Okay.
All of the audio stuff that we do is redfieldarts.com. Audio, redfieldartsaudio.com. And anything about Poe that we've done or doing. And we try to keep a nice calendar of world events, not just our work, but things to keep people
around the world that deal with Poe.
We try to do an events calendar and so we're putting one together usually every autumn, because that's when things get thick and busy.
Right,
but
sure.
PoeForevermore.com. So if you Google Mark Redfield, you'll find me somewhere, and there'll be something new.
And you're on Facebook.
I'm on Facebook. Some say too much.
Well, anyway, Mark, this has been delightful, and we want to thank you for stopping by.
Oh, my pleasure.
And we hope to have you back.
I hope to be back.
Okay, then. And what do you know, folks? That's the end of another Paul Stefan show, and we'll see you next time.
You're watching the Paul Stefan Show on TV Free Baltimore.